So we'll begin our next session, Chicago and Self-Taught Art, which will be moderated by Richard Cahan. Richard Cahan is the author or co-author of more than 20 books, including books on Chicago photographer Richard Nickel, Chicago photographer Vivian Meyer, and Edgar Miller and the Handmade Home, Chicago's Forgotten Renaissance Man. He is a journalist who worked for the Chicago Sun-Times for 16 years. He founded and directed the project City 2000, which documented Chicago in the year 2000. He is the co-owner, along with Michael Williams, of City Files Press, which creates media projects that harness the power of words and pictures. So please welcome me, join me in welcoming our next panelists.
Hi all, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I want, instead of doing formal introductions of our panelists, I asked them a few days ago 4 questions. You guys remember the questions? I'll tell you the questions. I don't know if you do remember. The questions was tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us what art moments spurred you to become interested in art. Tell us where you would take a friend if they came to Chicago to see art. And finally, I asked them for their favorite color. So, Lynne?
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
I have been at the Museum of Contemporary Art virtually my whole career. So I recently sort of semi-retired from there. At the MCA, kind of by default, having been there for so many years, almost 40. I became a bit of a specialist in Chicago art, which would include many of the artists that we see here today. And it's fascinating to me that looking back through the MCA's records, we actually showed many times 7 of the 10 artists that are in the show, which is quite remarkable. What spurred my interest in art? The cover illustration of the children's book, Bridie of Grand Canyon. I'm sure some of us here remember that wonderful book by Marguerite Henry, which was about a burro, a donkey that took people down to the Grand Canyon. The cover illustration is a lovely, lovely portrait of the donkey, and it inspired me to raid one of my brother's paint-by-numbers kits and paint a copy of it. I was about 8 or 9. This impressed my parents greatly, and they declared, "You are so artistic," but did nothing about it. And in fact, I didn't even walk into a museum until I was 17. So I have a bit of an outsider art education, I guess, from many people. I would take a friend in Chicago interested in art to see the Calder in the Federal Plaza. That is just such an inspirational thing for me. And how it works with the architecture. I could stand there for hours and riff off on what it means. And Calder's such a great artist, and I've done some work with him. My favorite color is brown, which is the color of the earth, the soil on which we all so depend.
Great. Okay, Nick.
Yeah. I wanted to start, actually it's great you talked about the earth. I just wanted to start by saying something about where we are. I want to honour the ancestors. It's a really important thing to do these days. To the east, I see the Haudenosaunee. From the north, the Potawatomi. From the south, Miami, and to the west, the Peoria. And I pay respect to the elders and ask respectfully to answer. Talking about training, I realised pretty much when you asked that question that I've also had a bit of a non-training. My formal education was in combined crafts. I studied woodworking, textile and ceramic, and then I did video and photography and performance art at the Slade School in London. My professional background kind of grew out of an interest in things that were off-centre. I always seemed to have found myself paying attention to the conversation that was kind of happening on the edge. My professional work involved a whole range of things, including working with farmers in communities, working in prisons, with the very edge of the prison community, convicted sex offender community during the 1980s, and then 80s and 90s, And in the 1980s, when nobody was wanting to think and talk about AIDS and HIV, I did a lot of work with people with AIDS. So I came to Chicago in 2003, and I found my home. I have to say, there's something very special here. I've been teaching at the school I came to teach, the School of the Art Institute, and I've been teaching in the Department of Arts Administration, and just recently moved to historic preservation. So what spurred my interest in art? When I was a kid, the house that we grew up in, with my brothers, we had a door at the front of the building, and there was this fluted glass. And I used to spend hours looking through the fluted glass and moving my head from side to side because of the way it changed the way the outside world looked. And there was something about that has reoccurred in a lot of my artistic work as well. I've spent a lot of my life looking through lenses. So that's, and then making puppet shows that involve light. So maybe light is a good thing. But in my artistic, like professional art life, there was a Nancy Sparrow exhibition at the ICA in London in 1986 that really changed the way I was thinking about making. So that was fantastic. Places to go in Chicago, I can't choose one, I'm sorry. I would take a friend to one of the remarkable collections. The private collections in Chicago are second to none. Something about the way that Roger Brown lived with materials, I think, is instructive, and he certainly believed that all things go together naturally and beautifully because of the way that they are. And that if you're going to live with objects, that's the best way to do it. So go for dinner with one of these marvelous collectors. It's great. The BFA show at the SAIC, we take people there, look at what's coming out, look at what's new. And I'd go to a new venue in the city called Oklahoma, which is in the venue of Mark Jeffries' house. It's in the basement of Mark Jeffries' house. I don't have a preference, all colours are great.
Great. Okay, so let's get this question out of the way because it's an important one. The question is Chicago really a unique hotbed center for artists who are thinking in untraditional ways? People that come from all over the world to this conference. I think generally we're starting with this belief, but I'm interested in your perspectives. Do you think that Chicago really is unique?
I do. I have a pretty deep background in thinking about these issues, and especially thinking of this type of art being recognized, probably, honestly first in Europe, but around institutionalized people. So what happened in Chicago is these are not institutionalized people who are doing it out of a sort of art therapy modus, maybe. And it's really a chicken and the egg situation for me because I think Chicago was fertile ground on both sides for the artists to flourish because it's such a, make-do city and a hustling city where you have to get by in many senses, especially in the early part of the 20th century. But it's also a city that allows collectors, I think, to break the mold and for people in the art world to think differently about what art is. And this goes back again to the earliest roots in Chicago. And I always feel like it wasn't so much that we discovered this field, the interest was inherently there in what the people were doing on both sides, the artists and the audience. So I know today we're going to lunch, having a Tuesday lecture reenacted, I guess. And I was just saying earlier to Deb, I do think that is an important event, but I think it's also been put forth as, well, this is the beginning of the real interest in this in Chicago, especially among collectors. But I would actually dispute that because these collectors had already been collecting Dubuffet, who gave the lecture. And they also had been very, very influenced by the field of psychoanalytics, which was flourishing in Chicago. The Institute for Psychoanalysis was founded in the 30s, I believe, by Franz Alexander. And many of these artists and collectors underwent psychoanalysis. They were much more sort of susceptible or maybe comfortable with the realms of the mind, which we see expressed in so much outsider art. And that's why they collected surrealism. And along with that collecting of surrealism, they would acquire more of these artists. I mean, Joe Shapiro, one of the major collectors of surrealism, had Aldobrando Piacenza, which I first encountered in his Wicker Park home.
It kind of like yourself, you offer a little bit of a broader worldview. Is Chicago the center?
It's a centre, and it's a very keen centre. I first encountered Chicago through conversations with people I was being taught by at the Slade School of Art, and it was known for its performance art. It was known for this experimental edge of kind of live art way back in the 80s. And what's important about that is, I mean, the school has facilitated many great developments. The way that deans manage things has allowed kind of new material and new ideas to come up. In many respects, once I kind of knew about Chicago in elementary life for lots of other reasons. There's lots of other folklore about the city. But once I arrived here, I realized very significantly that this was a place that you could say things and have discussions about details that you maybe that I couldn't do in Europe. And citing specifically places like the Roger Graham Study Collection, and having listened to lectures that Jim Zanzi and Lisa Stone were delivering about the language that we can use to describe this kind of practice. I'd always loved that material when I was living in England, and arriving here, I've been able to build a language around it and understand that it is something that people can do. So that, I mean, the ground is here for it. So yes, I think the way that it gets propelled, and we continue to teach it at the school and in other places. It's not just a school of the Institute. I think we tend to suck up all the air, but it's the conversations that happen in Columbia and Paul as well.
Okay, so we just determined that Chicago is a center, not the center. What is it about our special sauce that makes fertile ground for this art? You mentioned in an email that there's a lack of hierarchy. In Chicago, maybe you're referring to the United States, but tell me, what it is about Chicago that's made it possible for this art to flourish.
Well, I think the presentation we just saw, thinking about Maxwell Street and thinking about the kind of vernacular environment, I think Chicago's position again, the landscape is critical. I mean, Lisa talked about the idea of the absence of remarkable conventions. I don't know what I just recall it something else, but yeah. But Chicago sits within this broader landscape, and the Midwest supports so many kind of overlooked things that it's like if you want to go somewhere and be involved in kind of an easier sort of conversation where maybe the critics are not looking so hard, and there are supportive audiences. There's always a ready audience for most things in Chicago. You can find support.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you said over in England, what stood out for you from Chicago was performance art. I went to many of those performances. You're probably hearing about it, Red Oak Street Gallery and other places. That's not what Chicago knows about itself. It might be learning more these days. But in that day, performance art was certainly not what people were primarily looking at. I really feel the mercantilism that founded this city and has shaped the city, continues to shape the city so greatly, is a huge influence on where we are now, and many of these artists and of the trained artists as well. I really got my education through being the person who cataloged all of Dennis Adrian's collection in preparation for an early show at the MCA of his collection. And going into his house and seeing the way he had his art displayed was very much like, the photos that we've seen today of this horror vacui where things are not only floor to ceiling hung, but everything, is leaned against the baseboards as well, sometimes 5 or 6 deep, and bright colors. I think it was Ken's nodding here, but yellow and red and blue. And this was just a little apartment on the north side near Wrigley Field. So as I did more scholarship and certainly got involved with many of the Harry Hu artists and the images and how they collected these many of these artists and how they display things in their homes and their inspirational objects. There was no distinguishing between the interests of the trained and untrained. The collections that you showed of just materials and fun things and odd things, many of which were manufactured here in Chicago, designed and manufactured here in Chicago, and disseminated out into the world. I think is a very rich history that really hasn't been explored, although our design project is starting to explore it with the emphasis on design.
Let's get specific on this question. In the catalog, I think, and Ken or Lisa mentioned this, would Lee Goey, if she was standing on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, would she have gotten the same kind of, is it support, is it recognition? I don't know if she got support, appreciation. If Wesley Willis was in New Haven working in the Yale School of, I don't know, do they have a School of Design? Would he have gotten, would he have been able to do that? What's your thoughts?
I have a feeling that Lee would have been moved away from the steps on that. And Wesley Willis, I think he might not have been welcomed into some other institutions. I don't have a strong opinion about that, but maybe Nick has some thoughts about it.
There's something really special about the way in which people maybe don't get moved on, like just, the history of the city is somehow down the spine of Holston Street. And this way in which people are on the streets in a very particular way. Again, I think, I wasn't here for Maxwell Street in its heyday. But there's some really remarkable footage and documentation of the way the city looked. There's a really beautiful film which is called Holston Street, USA. I've forgotten the name of the director, but it was produced 20 years ago, which talks about that, talks about this axis. And the argument in that movie is that you can read the whole history of the United States on that street. It's so interesting. And it's about the manufacturing, it's about the way the city comes together and how it communicates. So maybe those artists on the street just make sense here.
Yeah, and I also think there's something to do with the landscape of it being flat and kind of just spread out. And despite all the architecture and real estate development in this particular neighborhood and all over the city at this point, it isn't a city that's confined the way Boston is or Manhattan is. And I think that allows for a little bit more generosity of spirit where people have a little bit more space. And we have alleys here, which a lot of eastern cities don't have, where pickers go through. And I actually one of the few people who knew Henry Jarger, and I remember seeing him, because I lived sort of across the street from him when I was a student, going through the alleys and picking out, the Pepto-Bismol bottles and the newspapers. And what if those alleys weren't there? Would he have felt comfortable if he were in Manhattan, going through the garbage sitting out in front of these Fifth Avenue townhouses? He would have been told to move along, probably.
So let me get this straight. You guys are saying that two of the primary influences on creating this community is the Chicago police, because they don't move people away, and streets and sanitation because they're a little late to become dark.
Well, that's a good way to put it. I don't think the police would have been called to move Lee. I think it would have been Art Institute security guards who would have been tasked with that, and they probably talked to her or friends with her, because they probably came into work through that entrance because they didn't have the staff entrance back then. And I just think there was a little bit more relaxed attitude, and besides, the police were going after hippies at that point.
Okay, we have such an informed audience here. I want to talk to both of you, and I want to talk to all of you about real influences that have created this situation. We talked in emails a little bit. The first influence, which was brought up many times, was the Art Institute and the School of the Art Institute. Should we divide them, or are they, are they together?
They have always been together. I mean, the school turned 152 years ago. The school and museum, and in fact the school was founded before the museum was raised, but there was previously a very long and contested history about really how that happened. But it's always been the School of the Art Institute, and that collection. I always say to my students, that's our collection, did you know that? And it's great because we use it like that. Yeah, I mean, the teachers at the school have been very significant, and we can begin to name people. You know, I know Lynne was it.
Yeah, I think we have a title of names, so yeah.
But
Yes, I'm just recently doing a lot of scholarship around women in Chicago and their influence on the community. And I always knew about Helen Gardner, who is the author of really the first sort of general text, art historical text that was written in the 1920s, and she was an instructor at the School of the Art Institute, that brought in, you know, art traditions other than the Western canon, the Western tradition. And she was extremely influential on Kathleen Blackshear. They actually worked together. Kathleen also taught at the School of the Art Institute. And then this heritage moved down to Whitney Halstead, Harry Yoshida, and on and on. But that idea that we're here in the, you know, on the inland sea, away from the art centers of the world, but actually have dictated the way things are looked at now, which is not in this high art realm of New York and tastemaking and art for art's sake, but art that's very involved in the community, art that draws and respects popular culture rather than sort of using it to signal coolness like the pop artists did. And this sort of milieu, which did spring out of the School of the Art Institute, this mindset of we go out into the world, our Chicago, and we explore it. This also happened at Institute of Design with the street photography that happened there. I think really has been extremely influential. My mic keeps going out. And I was a student at the School of the Art Institute when it was in, you know, the basement of the Goodman Theater, basically. I remember walking through there and always being confronted not just by the Impressionist collection, but you know, the Asian collection and all the other types of art that you see just on your way to school. And I know how influential that has been on, you know, Jim Nutt, Les Nielsen et al.
And let's talk about the images, because I think it seems to me from the slide presentation and from reading about this that the images really, I don't know if they were the first, but they certainly were influential in appreciating this kind of art. Do you feel that way?
I think that's true. I just wanted to, can I just pick up on something that Lynne said? I think gender is a really important issue here. Because, you know, while the men have been building buildings in this city, we can talk about the tragedies of the things that were lost and the things that have been built over. And there are many cases of that. The women were running the institutions in a certain way, and the women at the Art Institute of Chicago made it happen. And I can't help but think about the way in which, when I think about the school, I've got this image of Taft and the women that work with him to, you know, to build the World's Fair, you know, the White Rabbits, as they were called, always covered in plastic. And so there's this way in which, again, there's this students working out of the school onto the street into the community. You know, the addition to the two of them you've already mentioned would be Catherine Koo, who kind of invented and reinvented the idea of art interpretation and how, you know, how the public were engaging. And I'm putting together those three women in my head with Lee Doty, who's sitting on the steps, presenting another kind of image.
Where she's a you know an unofficial spokesperson for the arts, and whenever they did try to move her on by legend, she would declare her French impressionism as a reason why she shouldn't be moved on. So I think there's something really significant about the you know, the collections and the way the collections were built as well. You know, both the Potter Palmer was very influential. America Sat was involved. So this is not just your ordinary art museum collection built by, you know, industrialists. It's something else.
Yeah, and even the collectors of a later generation, Ruth Horwich was really the moving force in that collection of Leonard and Ruth Horwich. And I remember the time back in the old days, it used to be Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Shapiro. And I remember Joe Shapiro sitting down one day when I was hanging around the museum, and he was in, and he said, I just realized I have to change all my credit lines on all my gifts. It's got to be Joseph and Jory, because without my joy, I would have never collected all these beautiful works of art. So even, the seemingly very male influence as far as collecting, it was deceptive, and the true powers were often the women, and actually continued to be in much of this collecting. So it's, I think, again, we need to look back at our history and realize how open this community has been compared to many others, and this includes, the School of the Art Institute being really the only place in the early 20th century that educated artists of color, both African American and Asian artists, and that it's just been, amazing to look back and see the opportunities given in this town for both trained and untrained artists.
Okay, let's talk about the MCA. Tell me, was the MCA quick enough to recognize this kind of art?
I actually went back in the exhibition history, and it's a little bit more complete than the major shows that we did that are included in that wonderful bibliography that you put in your catalog. But the list starts back with Pauline Simon being included in the Don Baum Says Chicago Needs Famous Artist Show, which was in 1977, I believe. We did a major show of Adolf Wolfe in 79, which really influenced me. And the fact that was, brought in, it was someone at the MCA, I think it was Judith Kirshner, was very open to having that, what was called outsider art at that time. We included Marie Allen in the Ancient Roots and New Visions. She's most famously known as Harold Allen's wife, but this amazing artist in her own right. We did the outsider, naive and outsider art from Chicago show in 79, Judith Kirshner again, and Pauline Saliga, which included Henry Darger, Lee Godey, William Dawson, Pauline Simon, Aldo Piacenza, and Joseph Yoakum, most of which were in the collection at that point, or were soon to join the collection. And that's the other important aspect of this, is that we did value these works enough to put them in the collection with other contemporary artists. So the Dennis Adrian show included Piacenza, Pauline Simon, Joseph Yoakum. That was in 82. We did this major show of naive and outsider artists, painting from Germany in 83. We did Forrest Bess before anyone knew who Forrest Bess was in 88. I included Mr. Imagination, Joseph Yoakum, and Henry Darger in the Art in Chicago project in 96, 97. And then we started collecting Henry Darger in the late 90s. And it was a really interesting situation because we were so interested in him and my personal knowledge of him. I was one of the first people in the room after Henry was taken away. And it was a very cleaned up room that you saw in the slides here because it was before all the newspapers and everything were thrown away. And we were in negotiations for a while with Nathan Lerner and Kyoko to perhaps acquire the estate and set up a Darger Study Center. But there was a big price tag on it, and we didn't really have the facilities for paper conservation and all that. And it was something we regretfully had to think it just was not the right place to have scholarship on Henry Darger. And I included him in several exhibitions I did from the collection. The Everything's Here, Jeff Koons and His Experience of Chicago show, which I did as a companion exhibition to the second Jeff Koons show we did, included Yoakum, because that was an important figure for Koons and Jim Nutt. Several other shows, I included Darger, Everybody Always Wants to See It. Martin Ramirez, Joseph Yoakum were included in Seeing as a Kind of Thinking, a Jim Nutt companion show, which my colleague Julie Rodriguez-Whitholm, who's now the director of the DePaul Museum, did alongside my Jim Nutt Coming Into Character show. And then more recently, I did The Conjured Life, Surrealism from the MCA's collection, included Darger, Ramirez, and Yoakum. So again, all these artists were also put into our collection. So that, I think, is a huge testament to the interest of a contemporary art museum in this sort of material. We didn't distinguish it out. We didn't, say, no, that's really not for us.
All good except for not acquiring the Darter collection.
Well, I actually think what happened is probably for the best, because it would not have been able to be contextualized as it really deserves. Oh, I should also say Wesley Willis was included recently, because we saw that in the slide, in Michael Darling's Skyscraper show. So he's another artist that we've shown.
So let's talk for a moment about the elephant in the room, Intuit. Its influence on one thing that I noticed, I was amazed reading the catalog that there's been 130 plus shows that Intuit's put on since 1991, and all that seemed to be fantastic. But when I looked at the list, so many shows now have to do with Intuit. I worry that perhaps other museums are saying, well, Intuit will handle it, and that's obviously would be a problem. But tell me about your feelings about Intuit and its effect.
It's clearly, again, it's part of the reason why the conversation's been happening. I mean, there's a few organizations to think about that North Shore connection again between here and Sheboygan. The things that are going on a little further north and south of Sheboygan. Milwaukee has also been a place that those conversations have been nurtured. But I think there's also something about the way the institutions, because there was an exhibition at the MCA also where the artists who were involved in the Art in Chicago exhibition curated an exhibition of their collections. Is that called Chicago, Art in Chicago Some Resources?
Oh, no, that was... I'm sorry, that wasn't Art in Chicago, that was Made in Chicago.
Made in Chicago, yeah. That's right.
Yeah, and the collections of artists were shown in display cases and so on, very much like, the Imagist artists, very much like their shows at the Hyde Park Art Center. It was sort of a reconstruction of that. Yeah.
So I kind of bring that up because I think there's a way in which, Intuit and other institutions in this region are willing to put those kinds of things together. So you see the work off the street, and you also see things that have been influenced by it, and that kind of mixing, curatorial thinking is very broad.
Yeah, that you bring up a very good point, because if it's perceived that, there's another institution out there that can do it, sometimes institutions will defer and say, well, that's probably better for, DePaul, or that's better for Hyde Park Art Center, or that's better for Intuit. I think at this point, the MCA is doing so many collection-based shows that include all sorts of outsider artists. And, we've continued to collect them, like as Wesley Willis, that's a very recent acquisition to our collection. That maybe if, a big traveling Henry Darger show came along, we'd probably go, yeah, because that'll bring in the audience, because people are fascinated by him. But it is something to watch out for and to raise consciousness about that. Because there are institutions devoted to certain topics, it doesn't mean that they alone should present those topics.
So where do I go now to find this art? Maxwell Street is gone. I'm interested in where I can find it.
I don't know. Intuit. The Arts for Life, maybe?
Gallery. Project Onward certainly is a place to go. Pardon me?
The Little City Foundation.
Oh, okay. Okay. Please, where do we go now?
We have Circle Contemporary at the Arts of Life.
Can you say it a little louder?
Circle Contemporary is the gallery space at the Arts of Life.
Yeah.
Kim's Corner, I don't know how many people know Kim's Corner. It's a convenience store run by outsider artists in Rogers Park by Thomas Kong. He's filled his entire convenience store with artwork made of packing materials, and he has a basement stacked high of artwork that he's just made while he's working at his convenience store. He's an elderly man. You could go buy work off his shelf. Super great collection, and artist who's still making work today and probably for not much longer. Yeah, I mean, there's
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
people exhibiting and
That's
making
great.
work.
Well, that's great to know, because one of the things that I've noticed, I moved into Wicker Park, believe it or not, in 1975, before anyone thought you should live in that neighborhood. And the whole Wicker Park, Bucktown, there was a lot of really interesting artists decorating the outside of their houses and doing, these sort of installations, painting their houses. That is all gone because, we got to clean it all up and restore it and gentrify it all. And I know there was this major place on not Ellen Street, in Bucktown, Wicker Park, behind the Jewel, that recently, you know what I'm talking about? There was a sort of lots of colorful exterior signs and things, and that went a couple
Yeah.
years ago.
The Flatiron Building still has a lot of artists who,
Great.
Jojo Baby is still making work
Great.
in his
Yes.
studio.
I think you just keep your eyes open and look for interesting signs, and it's out there still. Maybe not in the same as much, but it's there. If your eyes are looking for it, I think you can still find treasures.
Is there anything in Rosemont, Bill? The Sunday morning.
I've never gone to that.
Oh, and is there anything in Maxwell Street, the new Maxwell Street?
A lot of good food.
Oh, okay. Any other?
I think that, you don't, the world's changed, and I think for a variety of reasons. I mean, eBay has something to do with sucking a lot of the more,
That's a good point.
important, sort of
Right.
substantial objects out of the world that used to be thrown away or show up at flea markets. But, I agree with Suzanne. I mean, my interest mostly is fulfilled by looking for signs, like hand-painted signs, architectural curiosities, the architectural accidents.
Right.
I mean, I think that's
stuff
probably
people
the
bring
most
in.
interesting and accessible form of this kind of out of the mainstream creativity.
There's stuff that people bring into Antiques Roadshow.
Aaron, you were going to say something?
Well, Bill and I have worked on the lakefront graffiti project. It's more rock carving, actually, and the simplest thing to do, and you can do it as long as there's not a lot of snow on the ground, you can park at the Foster Beach and then walk directly east, and there's some rock carving along the limestone rocks right there, but if you walk past the sand north to Bryn Mawr, you can see quite a bit right where the lakefront rocks start there. And what's the beach at Hollywood? I'm blocking on her name. Osterman Beach.
Oster and Osterman Beach.
And there's literally hundreds of carvings of horses and faces and crosses, and certainly a lot of graffiti names, sort of like a Kilroy was here. But that's very easy to do 9 months of the year.
Any other tips on where we should go?
Why would we give you our tips?
Assuming the good tips are not being handed.
I'd like to mention the studios that have already been mentioned, and that's Project Onward and Little City, and the other one that's in the city. But yeah, what? Yeah, Thresholds. That's another one. These are studios. How many people here have ever been to Little City Studio? Few people. I mean, that's where the artists work every day. And you can go there and you can meet the artists. I mean, some of them don't want to talk, may not want to talk with you, but you can see their art and they do sell it. And I'm a collector, and people say, oh, it's different now. Well, no, people are still making art. They're just not in the places. They're not, I'm sorry to say, in Maxwell Street.
Well, that brings us to an important next question. It's the future. And I'm wondering if Chicago is being cleaned up too much so that this golden age is going to end, or is that silly that the artists are going to be there?
Well, yesterday I got a threat of citation if I didn't trim my weeds and overgrown shrubbery along the sidewalk. That has never happened before. And I feel, and I know they go through the alleys now and they cut down everything. Yes, it's certainly in certain neighborhoods being cleaned up, and then other neighborhoods are sort of cleaned out. So I don't know, I may be a little bit too cynical to really have optimism about the development in the city and its effect on the arts. I know a lot of artists, historically have gentrified neighborhoods and move and find new ones. And that seems to continue, which is a good thing. But at some point, maybe everything will be too expensive for artists to afford.
Nick?
I think you've got to look in the suburbs. I actually think you need to go to places like Hammond, to Racine, Wisconsin, to Kenosha, to Waukegan. There are all sorts of things happening up and down the shoreline. But I also think you need to look at the 20-year-old that just graduated from school, because they're making their own venues. They're doing the things I think that many of us have been doing for years, but they have a different take on really what it is that's going on and what the production values are different. I watch social media very carefully, and I listen very carefully to what my freshman students tell me about what they're interested in, because actually there is a lot happening. There's a lot happening. We just need to listen to it.
Yeah, but I also know, having a young person in my life, in the form of my son, he is not particularly interested in acquiring material things. And that is really true of a lot of younger people. And you can, find the few that aren't, that are interested in acquiring massive collections of baseball cards or whatever. But I think the availability of everything on the internet and the ability to look at eBay and go, oh, that's a neat object, and then put it up on Pinterest kind of really changes that, oh, I have to actually acquire this object. And I know objects still have a great deal of power, because I see that in how young people react to things at the MCA. But I feel like that collecting bug, has been commercialized to a certain point with, Beanie Babies and all these things that come through branding connected to movies and whatever. And the true young child who has to amass a collection of, bugs or funny-looking rocks or arrowheads or whatever, I just don't think that happens as much anymore.
No, but they're paying attention to each other. They want to connect personally, and I think that's what I'm noticing more.
Yeah, but we're talking about collecting art here, so.
Yes, please.
This is such an incredibly segregated city, and I think we really need to understand more deeply what's happening south and west. And Art Design Chicago has been trying to make that happen through the shows at the DeSable and at the Smart Museum. As a part of the Smart Museum's catalog, they asked me if I would write, a pretty short thing, but something on self-taught art in the South Side. And I said, yeah, I need 3 to 4 years to research that with a team. And that's not really being done. So I think we need to, wander more and support. We're going to hear tomorrow, I think, from Patrick McCoy and others who really can speak to what's been happening there. But that's some big blinders we have.
Yeah, and I also, it was mentioned earlier about Wesley Willis and music, and there's a lot of music tied up with this arena as well, especially on the south and west sides, that isn't well known.
Yes, Aaron.
There's one more mini thing that we all can do. Just when you were talking about your neighborhood and them cleaning things up, there's definitely small, yard shows that I see. I live in West Rogers Park, and right next to the metro train at Clark and Lunt, more or less, there's some guy there, and I think I met him once. I think he's Polish. Oh, hi. And it's like at first it started just a few CDs dangling from the trees, but now it's like pretty packed. I mean, somebody should photograph it. Maybe me, who knows?
Before the city makes them take it down.
Exactly. And then there's a guy I went to high school with. I went to Sullivan, and his name's Steve Ozaki. And I walk by his house when I go to the Metro, and it's on Toohey, and it's just west of Ridge. And it's not very adventurous, but it's this sweet, it's this family home. And it's this sweet sort of like cairns, piles of rocks, and the occasional like plastered cardinal, and a handful, and then there'll be like a tin flower watering pot, and just these handful of these strange things that are almost purchased mostly. But those are two things, and then I know that there's a couple of Virgin Marys in West Rogers Park on Tallman or something like that.
A couple of Virgin Marys in West Rogers Park.
But they're, those things with the little...
That sounds like a great album title.
Little water fountains. But there's lots of good yard shows in Chicago that we just need to notice a little bit more.
My last question before we officially throw it open to the audience is, I was going to ask you if there's an age gap, if young people are interested in this kind of art. I know when I go into Lisa's class, I always see a group of young people who are fascinated, and I see this whole group over here. But then I worry about when I go to shows that everyone has white hair and is older. And so I'm wondering, do you think that young people are continuing this interest?
I think they are, but I think they're doing it in different ways. I think they want to pay attention to the material things without having the material things. There is a lot of really deep care for the things that we give them and the things that are around. Whenever I take young people to any of the collections or whatever it is, my students, they love it. They absolutely love it. But I come back again to the thing I just said, which is they actually want to engage with each other in those places. And the situations for them is really about that engagement. They're thinking about the relationships in a way that our generations, previous generations, never did. Their understanding of gender is way beyond where we were thinking.
So can you explain that? Explain what they're doing? What?
The idea of the binary has almost gone for many people. We have this whole series of discussions now about the way in which one defines oneself, and that changes day to day for many people. On one level, I don't understand it and don't understand how some of these kids are coping with it, but they are not in the same frameworks by any means that we are, and I'm enjoying watching the way, in fact, that they're making themselves into these kind of presentational beings that are really, enacting all of these kind of political categories that we've been used to kind of sorting through for about the last, 60 decades or something. They're doing something utterly different with it, and I don't profess to understand it. I'm amazed by it.
What was the question again?
About young people, are they as interested, and will they be interested
in untrained art? Or yeah, I think it's really, your study group, which is consisting of your students at the School of the Art Institute, is probably an important and vital one, but it's certainly not representative of young people in the United States in general. And I know my own child who, I didn't force art on him, and thank God he didn't go into the arts. When he does travel, he does go to art museums, and he is interested, and when he has friends from out of town, he takes them to the Art Institute. So I do think there is a hunger amongst young people to connect with material objects. They may not want to possess them, but they do want to connect with them, and that includes the work of so-called untrained artists. And I would just like to say, all these terms are hard, and I don't really know which term to use at the moment. But I prefer to think of it. What did you say? Mainframe, non-mainframe. Well, the idea that many artists can have training, but there's a certain type of training that makes you into an international, global, contemporary artist, and then there's training that makes you into Pauline Simon. So I think the artists who are not part of the art school industrial complex, maybe we could call it that, are the artists that we're probably focusing on here. But many of those artists are in museum collections, so young people can connect with them there. Now, how else they can encounter them and connect with them? I would think film is a really important area, and I know there's been that major film on Darger, and I hope there's some major or less, non-feature-length films that people are working on, because the young people consume documentaries at, a high rate. They also love TED Talks. So if people are doing TED Talks on this topic, I think that would be a way to really engage a wider swath of American youth. So like all youth, they need to be shown what's out there. And if they don't know what's out there, then they're not going to find it on their own, because, the internet offers you too many cute dog and cat videos to explore very much.
Rich?
Oh, yes, we're going to open it up to the audience.
Well, I just wanted to respond to that from an Intuit perspective. I've been watching who our audiences are pretty intently, and even though our openings do have a lot of people with white hair, I really see lots of young people coming in groups, in various assemblages of young people, and it's been pretty exciting for us to try and reach a millennial audience. It's one of our target audiences. And so we do a third Thursday Art After Work, where we're specifically trying to bring people in. We have a young person's event in the spring, but we're also doing some really sort of seeding those young people, if you will. We have two programs, our long-running teacher fellowship program, which brings self-taught art into 10 to 12 Chicago public schools every year and into the classrooms. But we also have a summer program, the Intuit Teens, and that's really a marvelous program because we somehow recruit 12 teens every summer. We introduce them to outsider art. They make their own workshops, and then they go around the city and they facilitate other youth during the summer, letting them know that they don't have to have technical, sculpting and drawing skills to get creative. And what was really fun this year is we had two teens that came back for their third year. They say they'll be back next year for their fourth year, which will be the last year that they're eligible. Ethan and Fanny. Ethan is white, Fanny is black. They are just so engaged in what we're doing. They're such leaders among their cohort every year, and they just love the art, and they love the other thing that Nick was talking about. They love that engagement with each other around the art.
That's great. That's great. I guess one question I'm interested in asking you guys, but also, I'll ask everybody. We looked at the work of 10 people that are on the walls of Intuit. And I'm wondering if you feel like that there are, if you're in this room, you fell in love with all 10 of them, I'm sure. And I'm wondering if you feel like that there are 10 other people in Chicago of that quality, or if there's 1,000 people in Chicago or 10,000 people of Chicago. I'd be interested in what you think. Are these people representative of the art that's within us all, is I guess my question. And I don't know. If you guys want to take a shot at it first, or anybody?
I wanted to comment really quickly on the collections discussion that you guys were having, and I think we all have a responsibility as either art lovers or collectors or gallerists or whatever your role is here today. But as somebody who also collects work, I think the thing that is most inspiring for me is seeing other collections and seeing how you could get into collecting. And I think outsider art is kind of the easiest foot in the door because it is the most affordable. So showing collections, we got to see 3 really great collections yesterday, and just seeing what that means to collect and how collections could translate from so many years, or how you start collecting. You don't have to be a millionaire to start collecting. So I think sharing collections is really valuable. I think as a younger person myself, it's really inspiring to see how that collection has grown over so many years, and what potentially I could do with my collection, and opening my doors to my house to show this work that I think is important. So yeah.
I'm so happy you said that, because we talked about dealers earlier on, but the dealers wouldn't exist without the collectors. And in Chicago in particular, there's so many fantastic collectors that are so smart and so complete and generous that's one of the things that makes Chicago what it is. Yes.
I just wanted to follow up as well on that, because I'm a big, with collecting, it's from the studios, particularly, that I think is really great for sort of emerging collectors and young people sort of start collecting artworks. So one of the things I always try to do is, if I'm visiting another city, whether it's New York or Osaka, Japan, is always go and visit those studios, and then you can always buy, a really interesting piece of work.
From the studio.
Other thoughts and comments? Yes.
I have a little cigar box full of ideas.
Wait for the
Hold on
mic.
for your microphone.
In 1871, the city got burned down and we started over. And I think that's an idea that is still ringing through Chicago. The two World's Fairs, where we brought in all sorts of objects no one ever regarded or saw before and were amazed by. Things like the Field Museum collection that grew out of one of those fairs. We are a very segregated city, as Lisa pointed out, but we also have enclaves of difference where there's all sorts of parallel aesthetics that have been allowed to develop and to be celebrated. The sort of second city notion where we had to be like the younger sibling, so different from our older brother, New York, and had to do it, wanted to do it in a very different way that gave a kind of a resistance to pure fine art notions, where I loved that picture of the painted garage door of Aldo Piacenza, that everyday object could become an art object. That the Special Olympics were founded here, I think celebrated the idea of kids and young peoples with difference and how their work can be appreciated. I think that's part of the history of the studios here. And I also think many of the shows that on Lisa's list and other people have referred to, look at how diffused the locations were, obviously Intuit, but the Arts Club, the MCA, the Cultural Center, the Hyde Park Art Center, the student galleries at the Art Institute, Roger Brown's study collection, the Art Institute itself resistantly, several important shows, the Field Museum where the Black Folk Art collection appeared, the Smart Gallery in Hyde Park where the Prinzhorn collection was here in '85, Luma, and a number of important commercial galleries, Carl Hammer and Judy Saslow and Russell Bowman and Phyllis Kind, all of those places that became so diffused into the city, I think has allowed this to become as infectious as it is.
Wow, that's great. That's great. I want to add one other influence. I was thinking last night, Studs Terkel. I think he really influenced us. I think he really made us understand the beauty of everyday life and everyday people. And if you grew up in Chicago like I did and listened to a show, you opened up your mind to what was museum quality. I know that sounds funny, but what's worth preserving. Any other final question? Yes, Bill.
Well, comments. Everyone's making comments. Well, it was both in terms of the question about young people and the MCA's role. For me, when I went many moons ago as a young person, one of the most influential things that really transformed my way of viewing, collecting, and what I was doing was the installation of Klaus Oldenburg's Mouse Museum at the MCA. And I don't think I was the only person who came out of that show feeling like, hey, all this junk that I'm just sort of buying at thrift stores because I'm interested in it.
The ray gun wing, too.
And the ray gun annex, I mean, that it actually had meaning. And that single event, I think, had a tremendous influence.
Yeah, and it's really important to point out for people who don't know, even though he's known as this New York pop artist, he grew up here in Chicago.
Yeah, yeah. That he was showing, that objects are just inherently interesting. That could happen again. I mean, when we talk about young people today, that a single event could be influential. One other comment on the question of Lee Goede and what would have happened had Lee Goede been on the steps of the Met. I actually take the opposite point of view. I think the opposite I think she would have become an Andy Warhol superstar. In other words, the difference from Chicago to New York is in New York there's this incredible hierarchy of cultural competition to the top, and that things are not allowed to percolate. And I think someone like Lee Goede could very well have been adopted. It doesn't mean it would have been bad for her or the world, but it would have been completely different than what happened in Chicago. And I think to me that's the difference between, that's one of the things that makes Chicago really does make it distinct, at least from New York and LA and some of the European capitals, is things take a lot longer here. There isn't the same kind of rush to greatness, and I think that's healthy.
That's great. If anyone else, it's almost 11, but if people are dying to make a comment, please make it.
Mine is more a question. So Bill and I were talking yesterday about all the rat holes we go down collecting. And when you talk about millennials engaging in art, and it's a very powerful engagement, but not collecting, when you look at 20, 30 years, is there a danger that the whole economics of, as they engage but not collect, and all of us with white hair start passing from the scene, that there's not an economic model to support the art world other than museums?
This just reflects the problems of book publishers. It reflects the problems of music makers. The world is changing quickly. Whether it's going to be good for society or bad for society is hard to know. Yes?
Well, I think the question of what young people do with this kind of art and the future is extremely important. But I think if they don't, they define themselves outside categories we created and we uphold, then if that would go for this art, this would be a great thing. What we see at the Outside Art Museum in Amsterdam is we have a lot of young visitors coming, and they're amazed by what they see. So they don't categorize, and they don't know the whole art history, and they're not interested in the whole art history and the hierarchies which are there.
The hierarchies, you mean?
Yeah, they're not interested in it. They just go and pick and mix and are astonished. And I recently met two very young guys, recently graduated. They started their own publishing house and brought forward several artists. I never heard of them, and it was. They had a venue in the middle of Amsterdam. It was packed with young guys and girls. So I think the future doesn't look bleak at all.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.